So if you, you may not know the name Harlan Ellison. He was still alive. He was a TV critic and writer, science fiction writer. And CBC did an interview with him one time, and they were asking him questions about, and he was very negative about television. He was a very big critic. If you ever know, his two books are The Glass Teat and The Other Glass Teat. So you can imagine his attitude is rather bad. And the last question the guy asked him really made him mad, which was, do you own a TV set? Now, the guy was obviously thinking, the reporter was thinking, someone who hated TV that much must not watch it. And Harlan just about bit his head off. He says, I'm a TV reviewer, you dumbass. I do this for a living. Of course I have a TV set. I've got 5 TV sets. And he watches them all the time, and that's what you have to do. So the question I have for you is, and this is highly relevant to my talk today, what games are you playing? Do you play games? Yes? Who does not play games? Well, okay, the old guys. You don't play games? That's okay, but most of you do. So what are we playing today? I'll tell you what, first of all, I'll start. I'm addicted to Angry Birds, I admit that. I admitted it on film before, and I played a little this morning, and I play it every day, and I have a problem, okay? And the other, I bought Portal 2. I haven't had a chance to install it yet, but that's the one I plan to get on when I get home. Okay, so I need to know this because it's important that you guys, if you're going to be in this business anyway, if you're going to be a designer, a developer, a critic, you have to play them. So, what are we playing? GameCube. GameCube. Yeah, but that's a what game?
Madden.
Madden, football game. Yeah. Okay. Portal 2 and Assassin's Creed. Portal 2. Did I waste my money? Is that a good game? Okay. Okay.
Bad Company 2.
Bad Company. Military?
Yeah, Battlefield.
Battlefield Sim, okay.
StarCraft 2.
Same kind of thing, right? Yeah. Battle game? Oh, okay, real-time strategy, okay. Anyone into things like Farmville or, yeah, okay, Farmville, yeah. My wife is addicted to that other farm game that's on the DS. Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing. Any Animal Crossing guys here? No? The important thing is to look at the range of stuff we've talked about. Okay, all those games have things in common. We all can play them. And the question that I have, and that I propose to partly answer here today, is what happens while the game is playing? What is the computer actually doing? This is something that most people don't understand. And I have an insight to this that many people don't have because in 1999 I went to Game Developers Conference for the first time. I'm not sure why. I just thought it would be cool to go to the Game Developers Conference. I didn't play many games, and I certainly didn't develop games. And I realized that I had no idea after the first day what the games were doing under the hood. Underneath that veneer that it gives you, this user interface and the graphics, what is the game doing? So I spent the next, until now, figuring that out, doing some research on it, writing papers about it, writing books about it, teaching students about it, because it turned out to be much more interesting than I thought it would be. My previous interest in research was computer vision. I spent a lot of time doing computer vision work. I have a couple of computer books out on computer vision, and my latest one just came out in December. I do that for money, but for fun, this is fun. Right? So the title of the talk will become clear as we progress. And I'm going to focus on driving games. And the reason I'm going to focus on driving games is because they are easier to make from a computer science perspective. Okay? And I teach in an art department. I have a PhD in computer science, but I teach in an art department. And so when I'm talking to art students, we talk about slightly different things. But if you think about it, if we're creating a driving game, we don't have character animation to do. We don't have to. Character animation is hard. So let's not do that. Let's draw a car. Car, you can, once you get the model for the car, you can view it from all sides, you know, drive it. It's okay. There's a bunch of physics that we have to do, but those physics are much easier than ragdoll physics. Ragdoll physics is hard. So hockey games, very hard. Yeah. So this is about the most sensible kind of game we could produce in a computer science class, at least as a first time. Now, driving games, why are driving games specifically interesting? I mean, all games are interesting for some of the same reasons, but games are about fantasies, and cars are fantasy objects. A lot of guys are into cars. They have a car they want to have, they want to drive, Crashing into things is something that we do by accident, but some people wouldn't mind trying it out if they could, you know. Avoidance. There's all sorts of fantasy things about cars. And also there's no consequences in a game. So if we crash the car, guess what? No insurance company, you know, no police. Consequences of failure while really driving are huge. In fact, in a game are small. And this is an important thing about games in general. If you're doing teaching games, games to teach things, the lack of consequences in the video game is essential. My wife is working for a company in Calgary, Alberta, on oil well drilling, and you can get killed doing that. So the game that they have to train drillers allows them to make fatal mistakes without actually any real harm. Okay. It's nice to know that they've done that already before they go in the rig, because they'll kill other people too. So this is one of the common aspects of serious games generally that we'll find out about. And driving games have all the aspects other games have. About 15% of the games on the market are driving games, including some of my favorites like Mario Kart, for example, which is huge fun, I think, isn't it? But there's a bunch of other reasons. So what would we design into a driving game to make it specific fun? What are the key features that we would think about? One is the venue, and that's true of all other games too. Interesting, exotic places make a game more interesting. They also make films more interesting. James Bond movies never take place in Milwaukee, right? They're always in exciting, I'm not sure Milwaukee's not exciting, but I named a place that I hear from secondhand reports isn't very exciting. You know, North Africa or Monaco or Paris. That's where James Bond films are shot because they're cool. Right? Sometimes familiar locations, as we'll see in a minute. Speed is one of the things about games, and this is something that's a bit of a fiction, really. We have to provide the fiction of speed, the illusion that we're moving quickly in a driving game. Mostly the games do this indirectly. You're not actually moving, so it has to fool you into thinking that you are. And so there's moving backdrops, things that appear to move at an angle. They're actually moving at an angle on the screen, but to you, if you're concentrating, they seem like they're moving past you. Games don't have any real limits. There's no physics in a game, really. There's no gravity. There's no consequences to a collision. So, in fact, objects frequently move way faster than they should. Why? Because they have to get through a certain amount of stuff quickly. The idea of a game is to do it, get it on with it. Right? Well, this is a trailer from Doom. If you ever played Doom, it is a game that depends on surprise, violence, but also action. And the guy who you play, the avatar that you control, if you time him carefully and look at him, he can max out at about 50 miles an hour. This is unlikely, okay? But you don't notice because you expect this kind of game to be quick, right? This is all very fast. It's all very jerky. So the fact that he can run at 50 miles an hour does not seem like a surprise. It is, of course, impossible. Still, there's a number of games that have that characteristic. If your game is going too slowly, then you have to give an illusion of speed that's faster if it's going too fast. And one of the points here is that there's a picture from Simpsons Hit and Run, and I timed it quite carefully. Lisa's car looks like it's going very fast, but it never actually goes more than 30 miles an hour. But because everything else is rescaled and the roads turn much too quickly and the other cars are coming on very quickly, it has the appearance of going faster than it really is. I guess the thing that bears repeating over and over again is that video games are about appearances. They're not about reality. I'll go into that a little more later. There's also, the fact that it's a game means there's usually a conflict. There are some games that don't have those conflicts, but for the most part, races have winners and losers. Wars have winners and losers. Games have winners and losers. You play chess, somebody wins, somebody loses. This conflict is a key part of the game plan. All right? And so you have to identify, if you're designing and building a game, you identify what that conflict is. So is it that we're trying to simply have a race? Or are we trying to go faster than the other guy? Okay, maybe. In that case, that's a conflict. Mario Kart has weapons. So you could fire weapons at your enemies, and there's a different kind of conflict. Crazy Taxi is a race against time. Right? You have to get there by a certain time or the customers won't pay. So there's a number of different forms of conflict. Those forms of conflict can be a key part of a game. So we go back to a game that I'm addicted to. And what the heck is funny about birds being thrown at pigs? Well, there's a different kind of conflict. The pigs are stealing their eggs, right? This is the principle of the game. There has to be a reason why all this stuff is happening. And as loose a reason as that is, that's what there is. And it's actually quite funny. Not all of those sorts of weird things are, but that one is. Most video games need this physics simulation. That's because nothing happens that you don't program. So balls don't fall, cars don't collide. Nothing happens in a game unless it's programmed to happen. So we need an accurate simulation of physics, and so when two objects collide, we have to have a fairly reasonable expectation that something will happen. And that thing that happens should be realistic. Or hilarious, take your pick. Cars skids, cars impact things. What if there's no gravity? Maybe there shouldn't be gravity. Maybe it's a space race. But if it's a car race, there should be gravity. Right? So players expect a certain amount of reality, even in Mario Kart. And the degree of reality depends on the game, but there has to be some, and that has to be programmed. Graphics and sound. Graphics don't really sell games anymore. They used to. Graphics sell graphics cards, but they don't usually sell games. But there's an essential expectation that the graphics will be appropriate to the kind of game. So if you're talking about a war simulation, first person, then it's going to have pretty realistic graphics mostly. If you're talking about Mario never was realistic, and you expect a cartoon. In fact, if from Nintendo, you generally expect cartoons. Those graphics have to be appropriate. I don't think Nintendo could carry, Mario could carry a machine gun and get any kind of respect as a video game. Okay? Audio is essential to a game's emotional content, but people don't get it. Audio is still the least attended aspect of a video game. Game developers don't respect it. They hate the fact they have to pay musicians to make music and hire people to do sound effects. And the fact is that people have high expectations for audio. My friends at Radical Entertainment told me, they're the ones who did the Simpsons games, that audio never sold a game, but it caused a whole bunch of games to fail. Right? So they don't get respect, and you don't buy a game because of the great sound. You might discard a game because the sound is crappy. So, what else? Props. For theme driving games, props are essential. So Mario Kart, you have weapons and things you can pick up, power-ups. Passengers can be props. Pizza, in the case of Crazy Taxi, sometimes you have all sorts of different kinds of props. And the way that you usually acquire something is to simply collide with it. This is unrealistic, but it's fast and it's easy. So in these games, you simply hit a coin and it's yours. Okay. The interface has to be clean and simple and expected. If you're driving a car in real life, you need keys. If you're doing a driving game, no, not so much. Driving games have a very standard interface on each kind of console device. Right? The buttons do normal things. If they do something different, people will become annoyed. Right? If you're doing a driving game, people prefer the arrow keys mostly. The second choice is WASD keys, and after that, nobody wants to hear about an interface for a driving game. Those are the keys that you're supposed to use. Steering interfaces do exist, so you can plug in a steering wheel to your USB. Usually what they do is send characters to the keyboard interface, so you have to train them. Right? But they're getting better. There's one. See, that's a steering wheel interface. I'm not sure what the game is. Looks like Driver, actually, but right? And there's a gas pedal. Maybe you can't see it. There's also an accelerator and a brake on the floor that are all plugged into the USB. And they send the right keys, key sequences, to do the right thing to the game. And you have to, as I say, you have to train them in advance for each game. They don't understand it. So, typical driving game. And this could apply to typical X game, where X is your favorite game. We could go through that, but I had to pick a particular one because they all do slightly different things. It's a real-time simulation that has a graphical interface, an audio interface, and this interaction that the user gets to control things that are going on in the simulation. So the display has to be fast enough to convince us that something's happening. We all know how to do that. We've all seen TV and movies. In movies, it's 24 35 millimeter pictures per second that gives us a good illusion that things are happening, things are moving. In TV, it's 29.9930, let's say, frames per second, pictures per second. But if we take a look at, if we examine the resolution and speed of a film as being reasonable, right, then 24 frames a second is what we have. We have to put up a new picture from our game every 24th of a second. That's 42 milliseconds that we have between two pictures on the screen to do all the calculations that the game has to do. Right? Hence the name of the talk. So what do we do in those 42 milliseconds? That didn't used to be a lot of time. Okay. How much time is it exactly? Well, okay. So if we have a 1.4 gigahertz computer, which is pretty slow, that's a tablet speed, fast tablet, that's a long time. That's 33,000 cycles. On a VAX, which is an old computer that I used when I was a grad student, it's about 12 seconds. So what can we do in this amount of time in the real world? Okay? Just to give you a matter of comparison, 1 second, light goes 3/4 of the way to the moon. Just flick a switch, a light switch. That's about 1 second. And light gets most of the way to the moon in 1 second. 1/30th of a second is the time it takes your eye to react to light. So anything that happens faster than that, you can't detect, mostly. Okay. A microsecond is about a camera's electronic flash. All right. The reason you can see an electronic flash, by the way, is that it gets brighter and then it fades away, but you can still see it. Nanosecond. It's the amount of time it takes light to go about this distance. Or it's about how fast it takes a transistor to switch. Right. And a picosecond, a trillionth of a second, light travels about the distance of a period at the end of a sentence. So we get all this different time scales. 42 milliseconds, not very much time, but long time by the speed of light standards. All right. Here's what we have to do in a video game in 42 milliseconds, based on what we've already talked about, based on the things that we know have to be done in the video game. We've got a bunch of objects. We have to know where they all are. Now, it seems like we always know where they are, but they're moving, right? So some of them have to be moved. We have to detect any collisions between those objects, and we have to figure out when that happened, because we are only looking at discrete moments in time. Every 42 milliseconds, two objects probably didn't collide at exactly that point. They collided a few milliseconds before. All right? So we have to know exactly when two things collided so as to compute the rest of the physics. We have to figure out how the objects have to behave given their current state. So how fast are they going? What direction are they going? Okay. If we're playing animations, the way we play animations in a video game is it's usually not the whole screen. It's usually a part of the screen. So we figure out which frame in that animation we should be playing, and we insert it into the picture. And the next frame that we draw is going to be the next animation frame, and so on. So we break up the animations into individual still pictures, and we play them back with each frame in the game. We have to start playing any sounds that result from any of the actions that happened. It's okay to be 42 milliseconds off playing the collide sound for two cars hitting each other. But we have to start playing it now. We have to determine where the camera is going to be. You don't think about this. There's not really a camera. It's a pretend camera. But what your point of view is in a driving game is usually behind the car, and you're driving this car around. And so you have to figure out where that camera is going to be. Otherwise, it disappears, and your camera stays here. Okay. And you have to render all of the objects. Once you've determined where they're all supposed to be, you have to draw all those objects from the current camera position. That sounds like a lot of work now that I think about it, and I'm getting tired. So that seems like too much. It's not, of course. There's this bar here. That bar represents 42 milliseconds. Okay. We also have to take user input. If you do 5 or 6 things in that 42 milliseconds, which is very unlikely, the game may actually not recognize them all. But so that 42 milliseconds period is going to be filled by activities that we are going to describe. Okay. Physics. Physics in the game, we're allotted about 5 to 8 milliseconds. Here's what we do in that 5 to 8 milliseconds in a driving game. Military games might be different. We have the engine physics, we have the motion physics, and we have collisions. Most games have the collisions. Some games don't have the engine and motion physics. Most games have some motion physics. Okay. Engine physics is about how much force is being applied to the car, and therefore how fast or slow it's going to be going for the next frame, next 42 milliseconds. So we have input from the accelerator. We know how fast, how much engine fuel is going to be sent there. Ultimately, I guess, it depends on what gear we're in, what the engine RPM is, what kind of torque is being produced. There's air resistance, there's rolling resistance, and of course, weight. So the idea of this is to resolve all those forces based on user input from the brake and the accelerator every 5 milliseconds. This is not that hard. There are equations that cover this, and mostly we can get away with fairly small deviations. Most people don't notice when it's wrong. But what we do is we find for any particular engine, there is a curve that looks like this. And if you want to be realistic about it, and some people are fanatics about sports games, these cars are supposed to behave just like the real ones as far as you can. So they have these simulators that show you, given a particular engine RPM, there's a certain torque and horsepower rating for that engine, and it's going to apply a certain amount of force. And each car is different. It's like people playing basketball. They expect the basketball players that have a particular name, and I really don't know any, I'm more of a hockey guy, to play like the real player, right? So converting torque at the engine to force on the wheels is a little tricky. But again, there's equations in physics that we could derive if you were of a mind, and follow all of these things into a simulation that updated every n milliseconds. I wrote this book a few years ago about racing and driving games, and there's a whole chapter on how to do the engine physics and the brake physics and so on, which just draws on formulas from the basically first year, right? And tell you a few things about where to find some of the data. Or we could cheat. And cheating is what most games do if they're not really excited about simulation. It's what Mario does, right? So make the accelerator a 0 to 1 control, max speed is s, so we're going this fast. All right. And that's a cheat, but you know what? For most things, it works pretty well. If we're not really worried about a simulation of a particular car, this is good. Motion physics involves a couple of things that we don't usually think about. Turning corners. We can only turn a corner because there's a force of friction from the wheels on the road. Right? So it depends on the kind of tire you have. Again, if you're not for racing games, changing the tire is going to have a huge effect on the game because it's got a different coefficient of friction when you're turning corners. What if the car's airborne? There's no friction. Now you can't turn. Right? So you go over a bump. Right? Okay, well that's a different situation. There's separate conditions for each of these things that the system has to check in that 5 to 8 milliseconds that it has. And then there's the basic acceleration and velocity from the previous frame. All of these other things are basically providing you with a delta on the current speed and acceleration from the past. So we apply those. Air resistance also, hills, so gravity comes into effect. We can do all sorts of detailed calculations if we choose to, or, and these are correct, or we can just turn the damn corner. That's also possible. In other words, just have the car, when you turn the wheel, the car goes a little bit more this way. Okay. Don't worry about the physics. But in either case, we still have a relatively small time to do that calculation. And how much of a turn do we do for a particular key press is still a matter of the parameter of the simulation. One of the famous rally games actually has a pole, the car behaves like there's a pole stuck through the center of it, and it rotates around that, which is a nice way to simulate center of mass, but it's not quite right. Now, games may or may not include collision detection. Usually they do. Understand that vehicles and all objects in computer games are fictions of polygons and light and shading. So the computer projects this image onto the screen that is a complete fantasy based on a set of polygons you've given it. Okay. So they can't collide with each other. It's not possible. So what do? Well, we pretend. What we do is we check and see if any of the polygons are close enough to have collided before we go crazy about this, because it can be a very complex task. A car can have hundreds or thousands of polygons in it. So we do, I do usually prefer sphere-to-sphere detection. What we do in that instance is, do I have? Yeah, there we go. It turns out I'll get to it in a moment. What we need to do also, if there is a collision, is determine when it happened. As I said, this is based on the trajectories of the two objects in the previous frame and where they intersect. Okay, that's easy to find. We compute new velocities. Do they bounce? Do they stop? Do they explode? Was it a missile car collision? Because that's a different kind of thing. And is there damage to inflict? And you can collide with terrain sometimes. So you can have car-car collisions, car-tree collisions. They're different. So sphere-sphere collision detection is easy because what we do is we find a sphere that encloses the object, in this case the car. Understand we have to do this between every two moving objects in the game. Or do we? So we have two cars, we draw spheres around them, and we say, do those spheres intersect? That's an easy calculation, right? If they don't, you don't have to go any further. If they do, they still might not have collided, but now you have to check individual polygons. Polygon-polygon intersection is also relatively easy, but remember it's 3D, and there's a lot of polygons. So you don't want to have to do that. By the way, just to answer my question from before, we don't actually have to do all of them. We break up space into regions, and if two objects aren't in the same region, they can't collide. End of story. We don't even check. Okay.
How do you handle region borders?
Sorry?
How do you handle the borders on regions?
The borders. Oh, well, I mean, what we can do is have, for example, if there's nothing in that region, we can ignore it. If there's only one car, you know, there's a number of special conditions. But the basic thing is to trying to reject as many as possible. So you try and rig the game so that that can't really happen in the time you've got. If you can't do that, you have to do more checking. Can the regions can move? You can have a region following a car. That makes it a little more complicated, but still not much. That means there are some regions that never get checked, right? So, I mean, basically, the math of a sphere-sphere collision is pretty simple. The objects aren't colliding now, and they weren't colliding after, but sometime during that 42 milliseconds, they did. And so we have to do these projections. Compute the distance to the plane before and after motion. If the sphere crosses the plane, a collision is possible. Now we check to see if it happened. And, you know, I'll tell you, collision detection, there's entire books written on that subject. And you want to keep it as simple as possible. If it doesn't matter, then don't bother with it. There's a good rule of thumb. I know the temptation is to do it right all the time. It's more important, and I'll say this again, it's more important to look right than to be right. So if we can't rule out a collision, then we have to assume that one might occur, and we go to the next phase of collision detection, which is narrow phase. We look at each vertex, project along the path it follows. If it intersects any of the other polygons, a collision happens, and we deal with it. And there's serious collisions and not serious collisions. Center of mass of the two cars hit each other. That's more serious than two fender polygons. You can look up ray triangle intersection on the internet, which is essentially what we're talking about. And the math is pretty simple, but we have to do it a lot. So don't underestimate how much. And we're still looking at only at 20% of our time here. Right? By the way, how does a car stay in the ground anyway? I mean, there's no real physics and no real gravity. So what we do again is ray casting to keep the vehicle attached to the ground. And we have different categories. Sometimes it's always on the ground. We never let it go in the air. right? As soon as you allow the car to go airborne, then there's all sorts of other conditions that have to be tested. Steering fails, for example, when you're airborne. Braking fails. You can't slow down. So that complicates the issue. Best not to do that if you don't have to. Right. So artificial intelligence. Some people would count what I've talked about so far as part of the AI. I called it the physics. So if you call that part of the AI is twice as long, twice as much time. Basically, we're talking about the non-physics portion of the simulation, a bit of animation, a bit of character and vehicle stuff. There's a lot of miscellaneous stuff that falls into this category, but really this is the interesting part of a video game, to my mind. Graphics, not interesting. It's a solved problem, isn't it? But strategy and tactics is part of the AI. So if in a racing game, what does that amount to? Right? By the way, since this is where the fun part is, I'm thinking about retitling the talk as 6 milliseconds, but then I'd have to eliminate all those other slides, and it's just a lot of work. So let's take a look at, first of all, opponents. This is one of the big reasons people play video games in the first place. The computer provides a convenient foil against which to play. Okay? I started with computer chess and tic-tac-toe. Those aren't really, to my mind, computer games. You can play those games without a computer. But the one thing the computer does in those games is give you someone to play with. Okay? I don't want to beat a computer at chess. It doesn't interest me, and I don't want to be beaten by one, that's for sure. But it's a good, I think of it as a training tool. For driving games, and for a lot of other games, there are some rules that one should follow. One is, do not humiliate your opponent. The computer knows where everything is. It knows all the laws of physics. There's no question the computer can beat you. There's no fun in playing a computer program that always beats you. Considered bad form in Japan, by the way. A friend of mine played Go against a Go master, 3-Dan Go master, and the Go master beat him by 4 stones. If you play Go, you know that's not by very much. And the guy studied for years, came back and played him again. The guy beat him by 4 stones. It's considered to be rude to beat you by a lot. The guy could have creamed him. But it was decided, the guy decided, I'm not going to embarrass him. It's not nice. So the computer can clearly embarrass you. It doesn't, because you won't buy the game again, or another game. You should be able to beat some of the opponents. The assumption is somebody on the track is going to be worse at driving than you, and someone's going to be better than you. Good strategy. Some opponents get dumber. And so this is a different strategy. Some game developers use this, some don't. It becomes playing they're better than the player, and they start to become less skilled, and the player can beat them after a while. Makes the player feel good, makes him feel like he's making progress. Okay. Sometimes they are, but not as much as they think. You should now you're going to be watching for this, right? Opponents should also provide a challenge, so they shouldn't be impossible to beat, but they shouldn't be trivial to beat. There's always one that is. You shouldn't ever finish last. So there's always one player against you that's really stupid. But for the most part, they provide you with a challenge and not an impossible one. Right. The ideal is to have this sort of Turing test player that plays the game like a human player would, and that gradually gets better as you get better, but never quite enough to kick your butt. They also should not all act the same way. So some of the driving opponents are going to be quite reckless and aggressive. Some of them are going to be very, well, the opposite of that. Not very aggressive and not very reckless. Try to take the safe route through things. Some of them will overbrake, oversteer. They should have different characteristics. Right? Preferably the same cars do the same things all the time, so you can figure out with time how to beat certain players. And of course, you should be able to adjust your level of play against the opponent. So you don't want to play the hard version of the game first time through. You want to play the easy version. So there should be these parameters that you can play against. Right? But it's easy for me to say that, and you're going to yawn and say, oh, of course. But how do you do that? How do you have a set of parameters that says, that really amounts to easy? What are those parameters exactly? Now, most driving games, you can't see these things, but there are specific paths that the vehicles tend to follow. The opponents, I mean. They are lines that connect what we call waypoints in three-dimensional space. So these are the waypoints. There's the car. The further the AI car is from that path, the more unhappy it is with that, and it tries to get back to it. But it will steer to avoid other cars. It will steer to avoid you. So it avoids you to get off, and it gets off the waypoint, but then it wants to go back. All right. Think about how you would do that in software. Again, a remarkably tricky thing to do, because the car is moving. Right? The simulated vehicle is moving forward along the road. It sees you there in front of it. What does it do? Does it slow down? Does it try and go around you? How do you make that decision in software? And how far away from you does it have to be before it looks realistic? These are things that you have to play with a little bit. There are no hard and fast rules. But you can see why you'd want to have this path. There are a number of these paths for each kind of driver. Right? And there are a number of paths, each of which has a different purpose. So the basic behavior is to move the car towards the next waypoint. And that's the simple one. Right? But what if there's another car in the way? Right? Well, we have the regular driving line, as we call it, and we have the overtaking line. When the car is going to pass you, it takes a different route. There's another set of waypoints and another set of lines between them that it follows. Where do these come from? They don't invent them. They're set up ahead of time by the game designers, by the way. So the game isn't inventing these waypoints. They are fixed. If you know that, you can see them all of a sudden when you play the game. You play a couple of driving games now and look for the waypoints. So when your opponent is trying to pass you, it goes in a different route. There's a couple of other kinds of lines depending on the kind of game we're playing. And depending on where you are. So if you're in one place relative to the AI car, this is okay. You know, it'll go that way. If you're here, it might go that way. It can't hit you. It doesn't want to hit you on purpose. Have you ever noticed that mostly the collisions are instigated by you in these driving games? So what we're trying to talk about there is a simulation of the intelligence of an opponent. And there's all kinds of that kind of simulation that we may want to do. So if it's a battle simulation, there's patrolling behavior, evasion behavior, attack behavior. There's all kinds of individual behaviors that result from an analysis of human behaviors of things and then introducing algorithms to that, which don't always work, but it works well enough for this. Neural networks. People ask me all the time, what about neural networks in video games? Not really a lot of time in video games to do neural nets, especially not training. Training is what takes the time. If you have a neural network and are having it respond to something, that can be done in a game. You cannot really train a video game neural network in the time that you're given. So, you know, what do they really do anyway? What would you use a neural net for? Well, you could maybe use it to control an opponent car up to a point. But you'll find that it's very tricky to get that kind of stuff to work. Genetic algorithms, again, too slow for real time. They can be you can use them for game construction. You can build and optimize finite state machines that control your opponent. And then when they're finally optimized, it's like pre-compiling stuff, then you use it. But that means writing an opponent in such a way that it's controlled by a program, that is to say, within a program. So in other words, you control your opponent by giving it commands, and then you program the genetic algorithm to optimize the commands you give it to pass and defeat your opponents. This works. Takes weeks, but you can do it and put the results in video games. Collision damage. This car, this is the fastest car in Simpson's hit and run game. Notice every time it hits something, something else fails to work. So it starts out with some white smoke, the doors don't close anymore. The damage accumulates. Now there's more smoke. Keep hitting things, now it's gray smoke. The doors are open, now the trunk is open. This is all indicative of damage. Oh, black smoke, get out of the car, because it's about to, oop. There you go. Now, there's variations on this, but this is all part of the artificial intelligence, right? How much damage has this car suffered? Is the damage going to get repaired as we drive? No, it's going to get worse. Okay, so once a car has suffered damage, it keeps deteriorating, and every bit of damage that occurs to it after that accumulates. This is obvious. What's less obvious is how to make that clear to the player. Notice I managed to jump out of the car just before it exploded. The flames were a giveaway. Sandbox AI is also tricky, actually. The idea is to allow people to do things. Oh, nice. See, I'm not seeing it on my screen, so. It turns out in hit and run, you can jump on other people's cars and ride them around. You can just do stuff, right? You can do anything you want. You don't have to have a goal. And that should still work. That's actually kind of tricky, knowing that the player could go anywhere in the world and do anything at all at any time, and you still have to deal with that. Yes?
You know, my kids are small. One of the driving games, they like to drive off into the wilderness as far out as they can.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes you find surprising things in the wilderness in those games. Weird artifacts.
Sometimes. You have something you wanted to tell us about? Do you know what the first game is to really allow sandbox play? Grand Theft Auto. Okay, and you know, it's the only thing I give them credit for. I don't enjoy the game. I don't really like the goals, but it was the first sandbox, and for that you have to give them credit. And as I said, AI has to look right, not be right. And my favorite example is this. Okay, take a close look at Bart. What's wrong with this graphic? What? Any ideas? The shadow does change. Aha! What was that?
It's smaller and bigger.
Right. When you jump in the air, you know what? Your shadow gets bigger. His gets smaller. But it looks right, so they kept it in. All right? Unexpected things can happen. In computer science, and I hate the term computer science, but as a programmer, I've written a lot of code, and unexpected things we used to call bugs. Okay? What they call them now is emergent behavior sometimes. All right? And you laugh at that, but when you think about it very carefully, emergent behavior is stuff we hadn't thought of ahead of time. It's only a remarkably small distance from a bug. Okay. And if we were smart enough, we could predict it. That's the other thing about emergent behavior. So there's really, to my mind, nothing magical about it. But it happens in video games all the time. Process of a complex pattern formation from simpler rules. Okay, fine, but what does that mean? It means it's too complicated for our tiny brains to have predicted. But it is predictable in terms of the kind of thing one would normally expect. And especially after it happens, you go, yeah, of course. Right? So trains in World of Warcraft, for example, anyone who plays World of Warcraft, that's, I guess, a common. I don't have a video of that, and if I did, it probably wouldn't play anyway. But we can't design emergent behavior. If we did, it wouldn't be emergent. But there are some things that are truly, and this isn't part of a game, but I gotta say, if anyone has a stroke of genius in them, there's a fellow named A. Thompson at the University of Sussex. He was designing a field programmable gate array to do a particular task, and he was using genetic algorithm to optimize it. And he got all sorts of these optimized versions. If you know about genetic algorithms, that's fair enough. If you don't, it's just an optimization process. And he didn't simulate the devices, he built them. So what happens is he'd go through a process of having the optimizer produce this circuit, and then he would build it and see how it did and feed the results back in. Okay? This is the clever bit of genius. He didn't let the computer simulate it. He actually built them. The result was a circuit that worked, had very few gates, but had two unconnected parts that did not talk to each other. And the device would fail if either one of them were taken out. Now, something happened there. They're obviously communicating somehow, but he failed to, no one knows how it works. There's a reference here if you're interested in following it up. This is also emergent behavior. But again, I think if we were smart enough, we'd know why that was happening. It's a side effect of not knowing enough about the situation. So don't be mystified. I'm going to skip over the FIFA soccer stuff. Okay. Everything else we have for 4 milliseconds. I say everything else because we haven't gotten to the last step yet. And playing, right? It does depend on things. There are sound cards that do some of the work. Sound cards are nowhere nearly as sophisticated as graphics cards. They don't do as much of the calculations. They're basically start and stop devices. You start them and they play a sound. They can play multiple sounds simultaneously. They just mix them together. There are more smart sound cards coming out. But really in the game, all you have to do is start it. Now these days, there's a couple of things. 5.1 audio is becoming more important. When you are listening to things, you turn your head, you expect the sound to stay in the same place, and you hear it differently, right? When a car goes past, you expect to hear the sound go by, and so this is an important part of the effect of the video game. If it doesn't happen, you miss it. Right? So the 5.1 sound is really very important. Mixing of sound is just different volumes for different things, and sound should disappear as it goes distant. Right?
Are graphics cards involved at all in sound?
Well, they can be, but they usually aren't.
If you're after that sound, that object in 3D space, but that object generating noise, you wouldn't use that.
No. Those are usually two separate things. So the CPU is telling the graphics card where the object is, and it's telling the sound card how far away it is. And so they're usually two separate things. Why is sound important? Well, let's see. What are we watching? Ah, now I know. It's not very exciting. This is the opening scene from Star Wars, in case you hadn't seen the original. Much better. Interesting thing. The first edition is more realistic. You couldn't hear a damn thing in space, but oh, okay. Yeah, but I said it's more important to look right than be right. It's more important to sound right than be right, too. Well, why is sound important? And it's really difficult to be too specific about it, so let me be general. We used to be cavemen. We used to be scared of large carnivores. That was our big fear. If you can see a lion on the plain a mile away, you're pretty safe. If you can hear it at night and you don't know where it is, you are not safe. Right? That's scary. Also, the sounds that scare us tend to be the ones that large predators make. You know, deep, booming sounds. That's scary. So this reaches a level in our brain before thought, even, and can make people quite terrified. Sound alone can make people very frightened. Also takes a lot of space. So if we do the simple calculations without compression, we can put a little over, well, some compression. We can put a little over an hour of sound on a CD with no room for anything else. So, you know, we have to find ways of reusing it. We expect 50 to 200 hours of gameplay off of one DVD. So we need to find a way to reuse sound, compress it, find other ways to make it happen. Program sound or procedural sound is really the thing of the next 10 years. Sound synthesis is something I've spent some time on, and I now remember the Arnold's cat map thing was to do the sound synthesis stuff that I was talking about just now. So here's fire. Okay. what I can do is synthesize that. All right. The way I do it is really quite simple. I take an actual sound, I took the original fire sound, and I resample it. You can't just resample individual pixels, if you will. You have to resample pieces of a finite duration and pick ones that fit next to each other nicely so that it reproduces the same sound, but never actually repeats. I got that idea once waking up after my son had been playing Mario Kart and then left the room, and I'd been recycling the same music for the last hour, and I'd been having nightmares about it. So I made it so that I could synthesize sounds that would change dynamically. I can do sound effects too, by the way. Missile. That's a pretty cool missile, this one. All right, well, it's different. And every time I play it, it'll be different. So that's the kind of thing I mean. There's things to do with sound. Cinematography, so the normal position for a camera in a driving game is behind the car and above. But you can have a bumper picture. We can have above. This is a picture from above. This is a picture from hugely above. They're surprisingly useless because you're not used to steering from that perspective. It also moves. It can't stay exactly the same position. Otherwise, it starts to look like the rest of the world is moving around your car. And the car camera stays the same. So the cinematography works like this. You adjust the camera backwards and higher the faster the car goes, right? Up to a limit. Right? And this makes the car appear to traverse the track instead of the track moving underneath the car. The rest of the time is spent in computer graphics, folks. So the rendering is done by the graphics card, but preparing it for rendering is still a complex task. Still requires a large amount of calculation, and most of the game, about half, a little more than half, is spent in graphics. I'm not going to talk about graphics, because everyone else does. But that gives us our 100%. We talked about pixel shaders before, and as we, anyone who comes to the talk later, we use pixel shaders in getting a blurring effect for the drunk driving game. We can do lots of other things. It's basically a small program that calculates effects on a per pixel basis. And it can be used for doing texture mapping, grunge mapping, computing normals for polygons. It's not my favorite thing, and I still consider it to be a largely mature technology, as indicated by SIGGRAPH, which now really only publishes papers that have images that took $25,000 to actually make. So, and a lot of the work is done by the graphics card. Right. And now we're done. The frame has been calculated, it gets displayed, and we start all over again doing the same thing. So that's really the gist of what goes on there. And each game would have a different set of things that it would do. Battle games would still be broken down in much the same way, but they would have slightly different things that the AI would do. The collision detection would be more profound. The effects of collisions are quite different. And of course, character animation takes a lot of time.
Well, let's thank our speaker.
Okay.